Hello, I'm Anika from Made to Sew and welcome to our beginners sewing tutorial where I'm going to be sharing with you how to make a skirt. Now, this tutorial goes along with our corresponding tutorial where we show you how to make the McCall's skirt 3830. I would recommend that you watch that tutorial in conjunction with this one because we're going to be giving you a few different things in this tutorial, but a lot of the information is already included in the first tutorial. We'll put a link to that in the description box below. So in this tutorial, we're going to be sharing with you how to amend the pattern slightly. We're going to be showing you how to draft a waistband for a skirt, and we're going to put the fastening for the waistband at the back, simply because I think it looks a little bit neater at the back. At the side, it can make you look a little bit thicker in the waist. And I'm also going to show you how to include a lining when you do this. So most of the components and things that you need are going to be the same as the first tutorial. One thing that may be slightly different is that I like to use a hook and a bar to fasten my waistband. So you may want to purchase one of these rather than a hook and eye if you would prefer to make a skirt with a waistband. So collect up your materials and all of the supplies that you will need. If you wish to line the skirt, you are going to need to purchase lining as well as your exterior fabric. It's really up to you what lining you purchase. I decided to work with a silk lining, a habotai, but you can use anything that you want to work with. So let's get started. For this tutorial, I'm going to be working with skirt E. I've traced out my pattern pieces as previously completed, and I'm going to be sharing with you how to attach a lining and how to draft your own waistband for this skirt. To work out the size that you require for the waist of the skirt, and we're going to need this measurement for when we draft our waistband in a second, we're going to need to find our stitching line along the top edge of the skirt. Now, to do that, we're going to measure down from the top edge 5/8, 1.5 centimeters, which is the seam allowance. And I would recommend you draw this in pencil. However, as you can see, I've done mine in red pen so that you can see this clearly. You will need to pivot the ruler with the top curve of the skirt to make sure that this is accurate. You will also see that this line is directly on the waistline for the pattern, and you've got two little dots that go through the dart there as well. Now, the front of the pattern piece is cut on the fold, so there's no seam allowance on this side, but there is a seam allowance on the side seam. So you'll have to roughly guess the waist size that you want to work out first. And we can always change that if the measurement doesn't fit your waist. So I'm working with a size 8, and I'm going to measure in from the size 8, the seam allowance of 5/8, 1.5 centimeters. And again, I've drawn that in the red pen for you. Now we're going to be ignoring the easing figure that it says here. If you were doing this with a facing, you would need to follow the other tutorial, which is the tutorial where I sewed this with the facing, and we actually ease the top of the skirt into the facing. However, for this tutorial with the waistband, we're not going to be doing that. So we're going to be ignoring the easing. And you want to position the tape measure so that the figures or the markings are on the bottom side, the side facing the paper. And we're going to position this vertically on our paper. Now this is the best way to measure curves, or the most accurate way to measure curves. Now we're going to need to position that along this line here and take the measurements. Now one thing you need to note is the dart is actually going to be sewn or removed. So you either need to take a measurement from the edge of the fold of the fabric here to the dart, and another one from the dart to the stitching line at the side seam, or you can simply jump the dart with the tape measure. So you either take two measurements and add them together, or we jump it. So by jumping it, what we're going to do is to hold the tape measure on the line of the dart, remember what number or figure it's on, and then simply jump it across to the other side and take a measurement all the way across. And the measurement for the waist here is 6 3/4 inches. It doesn't matter if you're working with inches or centimeters. I would recommend that you use the system that you prefer in terms of measurements for your body. So if you work in waist measurements in inches, then use inches for this. If you prefer centimeters, then I would use centimeters. So we now need to do this on the back as well. And if one thing to think about is that this is the front, however, this is only 1/2 of the front, from the center front to the side. So we're going to need to have 6 3/4 times 2. Now for the back of the skirt, you're going to need to do exactly the same. Measure down from the top edge of the skirt, 5/8, 1.5 centimeters, and draw the dotted line. You're going to need to come in from the size 8 that we're working with at the side seam. And because it's a back and we've got a seam at the center back, we're going to need to do one at the center back too. Taking our tape measure, we're again going to measure this. And we can either jump the darts or add the two figures together. And 6 3/8 of an inch is what I had. Now I measured 6 3/8. One thing I would mention for this is that you want to make sure that you do everything in pencil. I may find that because I've used a marker for this so that it's clear for you to see, that I've actually increased the numbers ever so slightly. So 6 3/8 across the top of the waist. Now this again, like the front, is for 1/2 of the back. So we need to times this by 2, which is a figure of 12 3/4. Now for the finished waist measurement, the front that I measured was a total of 13.5. The back that I measured, and this was for a size 8, was 12 3/4. Therefore, the total figure is 26 1/4. Now, this is inches. Whatever yours would be in centimeters, it's not a problem. But this is the finished measurement size of the waist that we're going to be working with. So this is what we're going to need to be looking at, not the measurements that were on the envelope. Because we have changed the pattern slightly and we're avoiding the ease that they've put in here. So you want to compare this to your waist measurement, or perhaps to a skirt that you've got in your wardrobe, and see if this is suitable. If you need to increase this, then you could complete the same technique, perhaps measuring from a different size, either bigger or smaller, depending on whether you need to increase or decrease this finished figure. Now we're going to go on to actually drafting the waistband ready for you to use as a pattern piece. If you needed to make other changes to your pattern, for example with this pattern, I chose to work with a size 8 at the waist and a size 10 at the hip, then please follow our corresponding tutorial where I show you how to create that, and the fact that it doesn't matter if you are a different size between the waist and the hip. You also may wish to shorten or lengthen your skirt. So again, you can follow the link to our tutorial that will show you how to do that. I've chosen to work with skirt E for this tutorial. So I'm now going to actually cut the skirt pieces out along the outside line, not the dotted line that you drew here. So follow the other tutorial, make any other amendments that you wish to make to your side seams, or lengthening and shortening, and then you're going to simply cut these out ready to use. And we're going to move on to drafting the waistband now. Now I'm going to show you how to draft a waistband for your skirt. Now you're going to need to take the measurements that you took from the top of the front and the top of the back skirt. And we're just going to be drafting a half of the waistband. So we're only going to need the measurement along the red line, obviously excluding the dart. Now, if you remember, my front measurement was 6 3/4 in inches, but obviously if you're working in centimeters, that's absolutely fine. And my back measurement was 6 3/8. So you want to draw yourselves a straight line for the centre front. Again, you're going to want to do this in pencil. I'm working with a permanent marker so that it's really clear for you to see. And then you're going to want to draw a line out at a right angle from your centre front line. Now it's really great if you've got one of these rulers that's got all of the lines in, whether you're working with centimetres or inches, because you can position the ruler onto the line with the line that you drew lining up with the lines on the ruler to make sure that you're working with a perfect right angle. And I drew my bottom line across first. Now along that bottom line, you need to measure from the centre front, the front measurement of the top of the skirt that we measured, which was 6 3/4 in inches, or whatever your figure was in centimetres. And you can put a little dash or something to start with. And this is going to be the side seam. So we've got from the centre front to the side seam, the measurement that we took from the top of the front of the skirt. We're then going to do the same for the back. We're going to measure from the side seam. And if you wanted to, you could make this a proper line so that it was really clear for you. Again, making sure that it's at a right angle. And you can measure out from here the back measurement, which was 6 3/8. So whatever your front measurement was in inches or centimetres and your back measurement, you'll simply draw that out from the centre front to the side seam and from the side seam to the back seam. Now I'm planning on having my fastening at the back seam, which is where the zip is planned to be in this skirt. I personally prefer it as I find that it shows less bulk on the waistline. Once you get to the end here, you can draw yourself another line. Now you need to decide on how wide you want your waistband to be. I've decided that I'm going to be working with 1 1/4 in width, which is 3 centimetres. So I'm going to measure up from this bottom line here, 1 1/4 or 3 centimetres. And I'm going to draw myself a line. Again, you would be doing this in pencil. Just like so. And then I would do the same again for the top line along the top. So you should have 1 1/4 or 3 centimetres and another 1 1/4. This line here, the middle line, is going to be your fold line. So we're actually going to fold the waistband in half along that line. Now again, to make this clear, we can write this is your side seam here. Now finally, I'm going to need to extend out from my centre back the amount that I want to actually overlap at the back of the skirt. Now this can vary. I'm working with 3/4 inch, which is 2 centimetres, just because that's my preference. And I'm going to probably be using a hook and bar to attach the waistband together. But you could have less, you could have 1/2 inch, which is about 1.2 centimetres, or you could have more, say 4 centimetres, which is 1.5 inches. It's really up to you and whether you want to have a button, a hook and bar, a hook and eye, or perhaps 2 buttons. So this is something you can play with over time. You're going to want to measure out from the centre back the amount you require. I'm doing the 3/4 inch and draw the line down. You'll then want to connect up all of the lines. So you should clearly have now your centre front to the side seam. This measurement, 6 3/4 inch, was the measurement we took from the top of the front skirt, excluding the dart. Then from the side seam to the centre back was the measurement that we took from the top of the back skirt, excluding the dart. We then decided to make this 1 1/4 inch, which was 3 centimetres in height, and the same again, so that we've got our folding line all the way down here.
And we extended for our overlap 3/4 of an inch and 2 centimetres. Hopefully that all makes sense. Now the final thing that you need to do is to add seam allowances. And you're going to need to add your standard seam allowance of 5/8, 1.5 centimetres. And you're going to want to add that all the way around, or should I say nearly all the way around. So our top edge to the overlap here, to the bottom edge, and the only place we don't need to add this is to the centre front. We're going to cut this on the fold. So we can do our nice little line with our arrows pointing in, and that shows us the grain line is to cut on fold. So when we cut this out on our fabric, we're going to position this on the fold line just like we did for the front of the skirt and for the front facing, and we're going to cut around it, around our outside line, which is our seam allowance. I would personally now write on this what it is, that it's a waistband for the pattern, and any other details that you may find useful. We're going to cut this out using paper scissors around our outside edge of the seam allowance, like so. So really there are lots of things on this waistband that you're welcome to change. If you want to change the width of it, then please do so. Have a look at what you've got in your wardrobe and how wide the waistbands are there, and whether you like them or whether you would prefer it to be wider or narrower. Again, you can change the overlap. Again, have a look at the ones in your wardrobe and see what you're working with there. Obviously the key figures for the measurement from the centre front to the side seam and the side seam to the centre back are taken from the pattern, so these can't be changed. It would be a good idea to position some notches onto the pattern piece so that you can mark those in the fabric and you know how to match the waistband onto the skirt. You want to position one notch at the side seam and 2 notches at the centre back, and you will mark them onto your fabric, which will make the process of attaching the waistband to the skirt much easier. Now in terms of the width of the waistband, we went with 1.25 inches, which is 3 centimetres in the width, and this is going to be folded in half, like so, and you've got the seam allowance on the bottom. However, the width is really up to you, and you can go with anything from about 1 inch to 2.5 inches, which is about 2.5 centimetres to 6 centimetres. And then you would draw that again on top so that you've got your fold line in the middle here. Now I'm going to leave you to position this onto your fabric and to cut it out. You've got the centre front, which needs to be cut on the fold, and you want to pin in your seam allowances as we completed previously. Now one thing I have changed with the shorter skirt, skirt E, is that I don't want as large a hem allowance as what is included on the pattern. The pattern included a hem allowance of 2.25 inches, which is 5.7 centimetres. And for the shorter skirt, I felt that was a little bit too large. So instead, I've changed the hem allowance to 1.5 inches or 4 centimetres, which is what I often use myself. And this is really up to you, and it depends on how you're planning on hemming your skirt, but you're welcome to amend it. To amend this, you're going to need to measure up from the bottom edge of the pattern the current hem allowance, so the 2.25 inches, 5.7 centimetres, and draw a line across for your finished hem. Then you're going to need to measure down from the finished hem the new hem allowance that you want to be working with. So I've chosen 1.5 inches, 4 centimetres, but again, you can work with whatever you plan to use. You can just use the standard seam allowance of 5/8, 1.5 centimetres if you would like to. And you will draw across your new hem allowance line and you can cut the pattern off there. The next step is to think about your lining. Now, the main pattern for the front and the back will be the same in the lining. The main difference that you're going to have is at the hem, because you want the lining to be shorter than the main fabric, so that you can't see it from the front of the skirt. Again, the hem allowance that you include for the lining is going to depend on what you plan or how you plan to finish the hem. What I would recommend you do as a starting point is to measure down from your finished hem 3/4 of an inch, 2 centimeters. I tend to put my lining in the center there, so that's halfway between the finished hem and my finished hem allowance. So measuring down from the finished hem 3/4 of an inch, 2 centimeters, and drawing a dotted line for the lining. If you're planning on perhaps just finishing the edge of the lining with the overlocker or with an overcast stitch, then you are going to need to actually make the lining shorter than your finished hem. You've got to remember that the skirt's going to finish on this line here. So if you're just planning on finishing the edge of the lining, it needs to be shorter than this. And I would probably make it about 3/4 of an inch, 2 centimeters shorter than the finished hem, so that you've got a bit of difference here to make sure that it doesn't pop out from underneath. Now you can draw out a lining pattern for your pieces, and I would do that for anything that was perhaps shaped, where the lining pattern was actually different to my main pattern. But because we're working with a straight skirt, our lining is actually not very different at all. And so all I tend to do is actually to fold up the bottom along the lining or cut for lining line that you've created when you're cutting out your lining in your fabric. If you're working with one of the skirts with the vent, you're going to need to do something different on the back for your lining. Now what I've done here, if I were working with skirt C, is to measure up my hem allowance of 2¼ inches, 5.7 centimeters, and to draw on my dotted line. Now this is my finished edge for skirt C. My finished hem for skirt C will finish here. Now because we're working with a vent, we're going to need to actually take the lining at the back above the vent so it's out of the way. I tend to measure up from the top of the vent here about 2 inches, which is 5 centimeters. You want to make sure that you start off at the centre back with a right angle, and you want to create a nice curve coming down here. So we're curving around the top of the vent, coming down, and I've probably given myself a couple of inches, 5 centimeters or so, width out from the vent here, and then curving again at the bottom. Now you'll see here that the hem that I've drawn actually finishes above the finished line of the skirt. Now you want this to happen when you're completing a lining with a vent. The reason being is because of this curve here, you've only really got a couple of options on how to finish it. What I tend to do is to overlock or overcast finish the edge of the fabric and simply turn it over so that I've got a nice finish and sort of edge stitch that. So something rather simple. You'll find that you can't really build a massive seam allowance onto the edge of this. So therefore you want it to finish above your hem. And I tend to get it to finish about 3/4 of an inch, 2 centimeters above the finished edge of my skirt. You're going to need to do the same in the front of the skirt, but obviously it will be straight across. So the same that you've done at the side here, 3/4 of an inch, 2 centimeters, up from the finished hem C, you'll add your line for your lining. And with this, you may wish to actually trace out a lining piece because obviously this is different. The one thing to reiterate is that you just want to make sure that where you join another seam, so the side seam and the centre back seam up here, that you are square and that you're not going into that with a point. Here is an example of a skirt with a vent that has the addition of a lining, and you can see the shape of the lining going on here and that it is actually shorter than the garment at the bottom. The other thing to point out is how I finish the edge of the lining, and this is simply overlocked and then actually turned under and edge stitched from this side about 1/8, 3 millimeters from the edge of the lining. For the waistband, you're going to need to position the centre front onto the fold of the fabric. And you're only going to need to cut out one of these in the fabric and one of these in your interfacing. If you're unsure about how to cut out the other pieces of the skirt, I would recommend that you watch our corresponding tutorial where we show you how to do that. In the corresponding tutorial, we will also show you how to mark markings from your pattern pieces onto your fabric using a dressmaker's carbon paper. Now, with regard to the waistband, what do you need to mark? You're going to need to mark the notches or the whole of this line for the side seam, the same here for the centre back, and I would also recommend that you mark the centre front. They will be useful guides when we're trying to attach this to the skirt. As you can see, I have sewed up the majority of the outside fabric for the skirt. I've sewn the darts, I overlocked the edges of my fabric, and then I sewed my two side seams following the seam allowance of 1.5 centimetres, 5/8 of an inch. If you are working without an overlocker, I would then recommend that you overcast or zigzagged the edges of your fabric after you sewed up the seams. I then inserted the invisible zipper and I sewed up the bottom of the zipper. All of the information on how to complete all of these bits is on the corresponding tutorial. And we also have specific tutorials on how to sew darts, how to sew an invisible zipper, and how to finish seams without an overlocker using a zigzag stitch. We'll put a link to all of these tutorials in the description box below. I've also overlocked the hem of the skirt, and you would also finish this if you didn't have an overlocker using a zigzag or overcast edge. If you had decided to complete a lining for the skirt, then you would need to follow the majority of the same steps that you did to complete the exterior of the skirt. You would need to cut this out of your lining fabric and mark any of your markings using either the carbon paper or by tailor's tacks and thread tracing. You can finish the edges of your lining with an overlocker if you have one, or you can wait until you've sewn up the seams and then finish the edges using the overcast stitch or the zigzag. Now you're welcome to sew the darts on the lining, or I'm going to show you another technique for just creating little pleats, which is what I tend to do. You want to sew up the two side seams using the same seam allowance of 1.5 centimetres, 5/8 of an inch, and press them open, the same as that you did on the exterior of the skirt. You also want to finish the bottom edge of the skirt using either the overlocker or an overcast stitch or the zigzag stitch on your sewing machine. Now I'm going to share with you how we sew up the back seam of the lining, and I will share with you how to create little pleats if you would rather do those than sew darts as you did on your exterior fabric. If you've chosen to create a pleat in your lining rather than to sew the dart, you want to start by matching up the dart at the top of the dart. And this is, again, the wrong side is facing out here, so I'm matching up using the drawn little line that I can very faintly see with my dressmaking tracing paper. And I used my pin to make sure that I was matching up one side to the other side accurately. Now what you want to do here is you want to open up the skirt as if it were going to be attached to the waistband. And you're going to want to push the bulk of this, if it were darts, out to the side seam. And then for the pleat, all we're going to do is on the sewing machine or by hand, simply stitch across this point at this stitching line, so the 5/8 or the 1.5 centimetres. And you'll find that from the front, it will create you a nice little pleat. So you can see I've done this one here, and I've just put a little bit of hand basting there to hold it like so. And that will hold it in a pleat, ready for us to sew this onto the waistband. If you are a beginner, I would recommend that you hand sew these because it will be easier to remove the stitches afterwards. and it will be easier to control the pleats. If you're more advanced at sewing, then obviously you can use the sewing machine to hold these in position. And you just want to tack them or baste them in place so that we can remove the pins and so that they will stay pleated like so, ready for us to attach them onto the waistband. Before we start to attach the lining and the exterior fabric together and add the addition of the waistband, we need to sew up the back seam of the lining. Now, as always, we're going to be sewing from the bottom of the seam up, but we need to stop at the bottom of the zip because the zip has gone into the back seam. When we sew the lining, we need to make sure that we stop underneath this. And I'll show you how we finish the lining onto the zip once we've attached everything together. Now, you may find that you'll be sewing up with your pins to the circle that we marked as an X on our pattern piece. And if you want a refresher on how we marked all of these things, please check out the corresponding video where we completed our markings with our dressmaker's carbon paper. However, I always like to double check because especially if you're working with an invisible zip like we are, you may find that your X or your circle isn't in quite the right place. So you want to open the zip to the bottom. And we want to start matching up the lining and the exterior fabric at the top, working our way down. Where the zip ends, we can put our pin for stopping sewing the back seam. You always want to make sure that you work from the top down because if you remember, the bottom of the lining and the exterior fabric are not the same level. So we have to work from the top down here. You can put a pin in, like so, horizontally to the seam so that you know where you need to stop at the bottom of the zip. And we're simply going to be sewing on the machine now from the bottom of our lining all the way up to our horizontal pin where we will backstitch to secure the seam. And we'll backstitch at the start too. We're going to be completing this with the standard seam allowance of 1.5 centimetres, 5/8 of an inch. Once you've sewn the back seam of the lining from the bottom to the stopping point, you're going to want to press it open as we completed with the other seams on the skirt. I would also recommend that you press the seam allowance at the opening to the wrong side by the seam allowance measurement of 5/8, 1.5 centimetres. And you can do this for both sides. And this will make it easier when we're attaching this into the skirt. Now you're also going to need to interface the wrong side of your waistband. If you don't know how to do this, I would recommend following the link in the description box below to our corresponding tutorial where we share with you how to cut this out and how to iron it on. But you're going to need to follow the instructions on your individual interfacing for how long you need to iron it on and whether you require heat and steam or just heat. You may need to actually take the markings across onto the back of the interfacing, the wrong side of your fabric now, if they aren't clear and don't come through. And I've just gone over mine with some chalk here. Now I'm ready to attach the waistband and the lining to the main skirt. Now it's time to pin the lining and the main body of the skirt together. You're going to need to put the lining inside the skirt with the wrong side of the lining and the wrong side of the skirt against each other. You're going to want to match up all of the points. So with side seams are matched up here. You want to match up any notches. You want to ideally match up your darts and your pleats if you decided to do pleats in the lining rather than darts. And the top edge here should also be flush. And you can work your way around pinning it all together. Now when you get to the zip at the back of the skirt, rather than opening it out like so, which is what we did when attaching the facing to the skirt in the corresponding tutorial, you're going to need to actually fold it in along the zip as it will be finished from the right side. We pressed in our lining at the 5/8, 1.5 centimetre mark, and that's just going to sit on top of this like so. Again, matching up the top edge here, and you want to put the edge of the lining about 1/8, 3 millimeters away from the teeth of the zip. You don't want to get too close because it can stop the zip from being able to do up. And we're just going to pop a pin in there. Now, if you're a beginner and you're new to this, I would recommend that you baste and tack this together. So take a needle and thread and work your way around the top edge of the skirt, basting or tacking the two layers together with a simple running stitch. It doesn't have to look nice, it's just a case of holding them together so that they don't move when we attach the waistband. I would recommend that you complete the basting or tacking at about the seam allowance line, so around 5/8, 1.5 centimeters. However, we will be removing it afterwards. The other thing that you need to do in preparation is to press the waistband in half, wrong sides together so that the exterior fabric is on the outside, and you want to do that all along the length of the waistband. If your fabric marks using the iron, you might need to use a pressing cloth to protect it. Using a needle and thread, you want to just complete a simple basting or tacking stitch. And that's just a running stitch. So we're just going to go into the fabric and back out of the fabric, going through all of the layers. And you want your stitches to be about 1/4 inch, 5 millimeters in length. And you want to be stitching around the seam line. So about 5/8, 1.5 centimeters from the top edge of the fabric. This will allow you to take out the pins, which will mean that everything is nicely held together. It doesn't have to look neat, it's just a case of holding all of the layers together and stopping them from moving. Now, as you can see here, I'm working with a red thread. You want to choose a colour thread that you can see, as we will need to take this out, but I probably wouldn't have used the red thread unless it was for filming so that you could see it. I would probably have chosen a thread, perhaps a blue or something. I tend to try and choose a thread that isn't the same colour as my garment so that I can take it out, but that isn't so astoundingly different like the red is here. Because what you can find is perhaps if you were struggling to remove this, you end up with little bits of red fluff, and that just doesn't look very nice. So I'd always go with the colour that's, you know, it was inconspicuous, but that you could see well enough to remove it. And again, I like to do a lot of my basting with a silk thread, especially because I'm working with a silk lining here. So it's very, very smooth to run through my fabric. But as a beginner, it really doesn't matter. Any thread will do. Now it's time to start pinning the waistband onto the skirt. Now the waistband is here, and you're going to be pinning the right side of the waistband fabric onto the right side of the skirt fabric. It doesn't matter which side of the waistband you use because it is symmetrical. Either the bottom or the top, it doesn't matter. And what you're going to want to do here is be putting the right side of the waistband fabric to the right side of your skirt fabric. And you're just going to want to manipulate those so that they fit and pop in a pin. You are going to want to match up your side seam to the markings on your waistband. So if you remember, when we drafted the waistband, we added a marking for our centre back, we added a marking for our side seam, for our centre front, and for the other side seam and the other back seam. So you're going to want to match these together and simply pin your way around the skirt. Make sure that you don't catch any sort of niggly threads or anything in between the layers. Those can be trimmed out of the way. And the thing here is that there isn't any easing. We built these to fit. So if you'd followed the instructions and you created a waistband, it should fit your skirt. We don't have to ease it in like we did with the corresponding tutorial and the facing. Once you're happy that you've pinned along the whole length of the waistband, attaching it to the skirt, I would, again, if you are a beginner, recommend basting or tacking them together. I know this seems like a lot of hard work, but I promise that you would probably rather baste or tack something together than unpick it. So we're always better to be safe than sorry. And it will save you time in the long run. If you're a more competent sewer and you've done things like this before, then you probably don't need to worry about it so much. But if you are new to sewing, it's just a good way to make sure that you do everything right. Now it's time to sew the waistband onto the skirt. You're going to start sewing just before the zip, and you want to be following the guide of 5/8 1.5 centimeters. And you're welcome to use the magnetic seam guide if you would like, and if you think you would find that useful. You want to start by completing a back stitch, so a couple of stitches forwards and a couple of stitches backwards. And then you're going to remove the pins as you go if you've got any pins in your fabric. You're going to sew along the whole length of the skirt, attaching it to the waistband. So we should be sewing through the lining, through the skirt and through the waistband. You want to keep smoothing everything out to make sure that you don't sew in any puckers or anything. And make sure that when you get to your darts and your seam allowances, everything is being pressed or held in the right direction. One of the most important things when you're doing this is to make sure that the seam that you're sewing through all of the layers, when you start at the zip on one side, goes over the top of the zip at the same point. So you almost want to put your zip together, and from the plastic bit at the top, you want the stitching to be at the same point, to the same measurement from the top of that. If you've pinned everything accurately, then it should be correct, but it's just something you want to always double check. The reason being is that when you do the zip up from the front, you want the waistband to finish at the same point. Now, if you would find it easier, you're welcome to actually draw this on to the side here with some chalk. If you wanted to, you could measure your 5/8 1.5 centimeters down from the top edge and draw it on with chalk to make sure that you were accurate there. Or what I sometimes do is, as I'm sewing it and getting to the end, I put the beginning of my sewing back so that I can look at the two together just as I sew off the end there. And that would just give you a really professional finish to your skirt. Now we've attached the waistband through all the layers, we need to remove all of the basting stitches. So we need to remove the basting stitches from joining the seams together and for the pleats if you did them. To remove the basting stitches, you simply want to grab an unpicker or a small pair of scissors and get underneath them and unpick them like so. Obviously be careful that you don't grab your actual stitches. Once you get a row going, you should find it easier. And you can then pull on the stitches to remove them. If you get any small little tufts that you can't get rid of, then what I would recommend is that perhaps you get a pair of tweezers, and that can often be very good at grabbing the small little tufts that you can't get with your fingers or nails. Join me back here when you've done this. Once you've removed all of the basting and tacking threads from your waistband seam, you're going to want to press the seam up towards the waistband. And you're going to want to do that all the way along, and you're pressing up the lining, the waistband seam allowance, and the body or the exterior of the skirt. You also want to press down towards the wrong side of the waistband, the seam allowance of the waistband along the top edge. Now this is 5/8 of an inch, 1.5 centimeters, and you can measure this as you go. You want to measure it and again press down that top edge. Once you've pressed up the seam allowances at the bottom and pressed the seam allowance at the top, the idea is that we're going to be able to fold this in half along the original pressed fold line. Now before we do that, you will probably find that your skirt is a little bit bulky. We've got a lot of seam allowances along this bottom edge here, so we need to grade them or trim them down to remove some of the bulk. Whenever you're grading a seam, it means that you're going to trim the seam allowances down to sort of a staggered, so none of them are at the same point. They're going to be staggered from each other. Now, the rules of grading are that the seam allowance that is closest to the outside of the garment always has to be the largest seam allowance. So when we look at this, the seam allowance of the waistband here is going to be the closest to the outside of the garment, and therefore that one needs to stay the largest. And this will stop us having a ridge or anything that we can see through on the right side of the garment. So I decided to trim down my lining to about 1/8 away from my stitching. And you just want to use a small sharp pair of scissors for doing this. And just be careful that you're only cutting through what you intend to cut through. I like to sort of keep a finger behind this so that I know what I'm doing. And you can just work your way along the project doing this. Then the next layer is the seam allowance of my skirt. So I'm going to aim to sort of trim that ever so slightly larger than the lining. So I'm trimming that at about 1/4 of an inch, 5 millimeters from my original stitching line. And I'll continue this all the way along the waistband seam. And I'm going to leave the seam allowance of my waistband as it is. So we've sort of got a bit of a step there between the 3 layers. Now I can fold that down on my fold line and see what that feels like. And the thing with this is that there isn't necessarily a right or wrong answer, because it does depend on the fabric you're working with. If you're working with a thicker fabric, you may need to trim them a little bit more or stagger them a bit more, and it really depends on what you are working with. For this fabric, it is still a little bit thick, so what I've decided to do is, now that I've pressed down my 5/8, 1.5 centimeters of my seam allowance at the top edge of my waistband, I'm going to trim this down a little bit as well, because this is going to come on top of everything. So this is going to be towards the inside. So I decided to trim this down in about by half. And now I can fold that, and that feels so much better. That really isn't bulky anymore, and I'm really happy with that. Another thing to point out is that I have sort of trimmed across the top of the zip here. That's absolutely fine, because I would have needed to have trimmed that in line with my exterior fabric. So you're going to want to do this all the way along your seam allowances for your waistband. And you can join me back here when you've done that, and then I can share with you how we're going to finish the waistband at the seams, at the edge here, and how we're actually going to attach it down on top of the lining. To finish the end of our waistband, we're going to fold the waistband in half with the right sides together. We pressed our fold line, which is how the waistband is going to be finished in a second. So we want to fold along that exact line, but with the right sides of the fabric facing each other, matching up the end of the waistband here and matching up the 2 pressed edges here. We pressed up the seam allowances on both sides, so that should sit as it wants to. You will see here that I've got a smaller seam allowance on one side than I've got on the other. That's not a problem, that's because I trimmed this one down. Now we're going to be sewing along the edge like so, following our seam allowance of 5/8, 1.5 centimeters. I would recommend, however, that you start sewing at this edge and sew towards the fold line. The reason being is, if you were to sew from the fold line down, you would probably find that your seam allowances get pushed this way. So if we're going to be doing it from here up, we need to turn this over, bulk of the fabric on the left at the sewing machine, and we can pop our pin in here to hold this. Now join me at the sewing machine and I'll show you how we sew this. Backstitch at the start and the end and follow the required seam allowance. And you want to, again, when you get to the folded edge here, we really want to almost sew off it and back onto it to make sure that you don't have a hole there. Check you're happy with the stitching first by turning it around to the right side. Once you're happy with it, you want to chop off the corner like so and trim the seam allowance on the inside of the waistband smaller than the one on the outside. You may also find you need to trim off a bit of the corner here so that when you turn this around, you get a nice finish. And you really just want to poke out the corner using a point turner, or be very careful with a pair of scissors so that you're happy with the finish that you have achieved. Once you're happy with your corner here, you're going to tuck in all of the fraying edges and pin it in place. And you're going to do this along the whole of the waistband. The pressed edge of the waistband here needs to cover just the stitching line that you see there. So you can work your way along, pinning everything together, tucking away any of the fraying edges of the fabric. Once you're happy that everything is pinned and ready to go, you've got two options. The first option would be to stitch this by hand sewing it, and that's the option I'm going to share with you, and I would probably recommend that as the best option for beginners. We're going to complete a slip stitch or a fell stitch to attach the waistband securely to the other layers. The other option, if you prefer using the sewing machine, is to sew what's called stitch in the ditch of where the waistband joins the body of the skirt. You want to sew in the ditch here, which should catch the waistband on the other side. If you're going to complete that method, the first thing that I would say is you must baste or tack your waistband down here where you've pinned it. You need to baste it so that it's all happy, and so that you know from this side, if you were to put a pin in the ditch here, that you would catch the waistband on the other side. And ideally you want to be consistent with this, but the most important thing is that you baste it. Now I'm going to show you the slip stitch or the fell stitch that we're going to use to attach the waistband down on top of the lining. You want to thread your needle with a double thread. And if you'd like to follow my method on how to do this, you can follow the link to the specific tutorial in the description box below. The method that I will use will help to stop the thread from slipping around in the needle. Now, as you can see, my thread here has come out on the folded edge of the waistband. You're going to go directly above this into the lining and the seam allowances of the body of the skirt. And I would do this just underneath or on the stitching line there. You're going to go through for about 1/4 of an inch, 5 millimeters. And when you come out, you're going to come out on the edge of the fold of the waistband again and pull that through. Nice and snug. And ideally you want the folded edge of the waistband to just cover the stitching. So again, we've come out on the edge of the waistband here. We're going to go directly above it into the fabric, through the seam allowances, not through to the right side, along, and then again coming out on the top edge fold of our waistband. And again, we pull that through. And you're going to do this all the way along. So again, we've come out on the folded edge of the waistband, directly above this, into our fabric, put the needle through. So the needle's almost going in sort of diagonal way, and this is the difference really between a fell stitch and a slip stitch. So I would refer to this as a fell stitch because we're going through the fabric and keeping the needle in the fabric. And we're coming out on the folded edge of our waistband. And you want these stitches to be about 1/4 of an inch, 5 millimeters in length. And you can work all the way along the waistband edge. When you get to your overlap, you can either continue doing the little fell stitch that we were doing, or complete more of a ladder stitch, which is when we pick up a small amount on one side of our folded edge of fabric. We go directly opposite where the thread has come out and pick up a small bit of the other side. Now again, I have a specific tutorial that will show you this in more detail, and we'll put a link to that in the description box below. Make sure that you tuck in any of the fraying edges to make sure that this is really neat. Now you're going to want to complete the same slip stitch or fell stitch to attach the lining onto the zip. We already pressed under the lining, and ideally you just want to position the pressed edge of the lining about halfway in the center of the zipper tape. You don't want it to be too close to the zipper teeth because it can prevent the zipper from doing up. Again, with your double thread, you're going to simply work your way along, completing the fell stitch. Again, the stitch length should be approximately 1/4 inch to 5 millimeters. It may be a good idea to do up the zip at the bottom so that you can evenly distribute the two sides of the lining. And then you will continue the fell stitch or slip stitch around, down as close to the bottom of the zip as you can, and back up the other side. Now it's time to finish the hem of your skirt. If you're working on a skirt with a vent, then I would recommend that you refer to our previous tutorial, and we'll put a link to that in the description box below. We'll show you how to finish the hem and how to mite at your vent for a professional finish. Now with this skirt, we're just working with a standard hem, and you've got a couple of options. Either you could do what I've done here, which is to simply press up my hem allowance. Now, if you remember, I changed my hem allowance from the pattern's 2 1/4 inches, 5.7 centimeters, to 1.5 inches, which was 4 centimeters. So remember what your hem allowance is that you're working with, and I pressed that up to start with. I then completed a herringbone catch stitch to hand sew and hold this down, and I'm really happy with that, and you can't see that from the right side. If you would like to do this, then please follow the link to our herringbone catch stitch tutorial in the description box below. If you prefer not to hand sew your hem, another option would be to fold up your hem by half the hem allowance. So you'd fold it up by whatever the half the fuller hem allowance is, and then fold it up again. For lighter weight fabrics, this is fantastic. And you would stitch along the top edge here. Obviously, your hem allowance would be smaller. If you're working with the hem allowance that I'm working with, the 1.5 inches, 4 centimeters, you'd fold it up by 3/4 inch, 2 centimeters, and then 3/4 inch, 2 centimeters again. Stitching about 1/8, 3 millimeters from the top edge on the sewing machine, and you would see this from the right side. So it does depend on what you're working with, the fabric that you're working with, and the look that you want for your skirt. Now, when it comes to the lining, you've got a couple of options as well. You could just leave the lining finished with an overlocker or with an overcast stitch, or you could again do the double folded hem with this. You could fold it up and fold it up again, stitching close to the top folded edge. The key here is that you want to make sure that the lining is smaller than your skirt. You don't want the lining, which currently it does, because I finished the hem of my skirt and haven't finished the hem of my lining, to peek out below the skirt. To finish off the waistband, you're going to need to attach a hook and bar or a hook and eye so that you can actually attach the overlap together. Now, I tend to work with a hook and bar just because I personally prefer using them when I'm wearing a garment. They're a little bit easier to use and less fiddly. You're going to want to position the hook on the part of the overlap that's going to sit on the top, because this is going to catch into the bar and lock. And then the bar is going to go on the bottom overlap, like so. You want to position the start of the hook about 1/4 inch, 5 millimeters from the edge of the top overlap, and it needs to be about central. Now, I've sewn mine on with a double thread through my needle, and again, if you'd like to see the method that I use to position a double thread through my needle, you can follow the link in the description box below to a specific tutorial. Now, I've sewn my hook on using a buttonhole stitch. I tend to use a buttonhole stitch because it's a little bit more secure. It's always best, I personally find, to get the hook on first, because then it allows me to see where I want to position the bar. To find the location of the bar, I position the bar onto the hook as if the hook and bar were fastened. I then close the overlap, and from the right side, check that I've overlapped everything by the right amount, that the zip is looking nice and flat. I then try and peek inside and sort of find the location of the bar, holding it in position while I undo the hook and bar. And then I might use a pin or something just to hold it in place while I sew on the other side. Now I've threaded my needle with a double thread, and I'm going to start by going through the fabric and through the hole in the hook and bar. And what I tend to do is complete what's called the buttonhole stitch. So as I'm pulling it through, I've created a loop here, and I'm going to take the needle through the loop, and that creates an ever so small knot at the top of that stitch. The key when you're sewing a hook and eye or hook and bar on is to try and be neat with these. You can end up with them looking really, really messy. So you want to make sure when you go in with your needle that you are going in sort of next to this, so you're stitching across it, and that you're really sort of trying to go in almost behind the hook and bar and coming up inside the bar, but you're doing so with a very, very small stitch. You just really want to try and keep this as neat as you can. And through the loop again. Same with the next one. And it's an easy stitch to do. The key is really just to take small stitches as you're going into and out of the fabric so that it looks neat. And if you follow my tutorial on how to thread your needle, you should find with the double thread, you should find that you don't have problems with that twisting. And you want to do this all the way across, and when you get to the end, you can either tie a knot or you can lose your thread.
So now you should have been able to finish your skirt. I would recommend that you finish off by giving it a nice press. I really hope you've enjoyed this tutorial and that you've learned something new. Thanks for watching.